Well, the answer to that is yes and no. It's yes in that 193 countries who are party to the CBD, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, they got together and they agreed that there should be no large-scale geoengineering activities, so research or deployment, unless the need was demonstrated and certain conditions were fulfilled. It's no in that the decision at the CBD wasn't legally binding. The language was, perhaps not unusually for a UN agreement, fairly confusing in that it, I think, requested that parties consider ensuring that no large-scale stuff goes ahead, which is most certainly not a clear directive. And one thing that was left open is that small-scale research out of doors is still allowed. That's one thing that was left in the agreement. So it's not clear whether there is a moratorium on all geoengineering activity. It seems that at the CBD, at least, the decision was made that large-scale stuff that's risky and potentially dangerous shouldn't go ahead unless the need is proven. Small-scale research that might be useful and informative and help us understand more that's out of doors, that can go ahead. I guess the simplest reason as to why we might want to do field experiments is to be able to learn things from them. So one of the great misunderstandings about field experimentation with solar geoengineering, which I work on, is that people think that you can either do indoors research in the laboratory and computer modelling, or if you go out of the lab, you're doing full scale deployment scale research into geoengineering and all of the risks that brings with it. And that's not the case. There are all sorts of potentially very useful experiments that can be done out of doors that are very low physical risk. The problem with that, though, is there are currently no internationally agreed governance arrangements to say what is small scale, so what is low physical risk, and what is large scale. And for many people, the physical risks aren't perhaps the biggest concern. It's the socio-political risks. So the idea, for example, that the concept of geoengineering will cause a moral hazard, in that people will hear about geoengineering, it will reduce their desire to do the necessary mitigation activities, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, for example, because they feel that there's a plan B out there. And there's also the idea of a slippery slope, that once we start to do research out of doors, the impetus will grow and grow for us to go from small experiments to larger experiments. And the risk is that uncritically we move from small-scale experimentation through to things that are larger scale and much riskier. So these are real things to be concerned about when research leaves the laboratory. The question is where the balance of risk and benefits lies, whether we would be well served to go out and start doing smaller scale experimentation, or whether that's something we want to delay for the while. That's a question that really divides a lot of commentators who are looking at geoengineering. Perhaps surprisingly, I think there's quite a large amount of agreement over what we want to do in the medium term, over the sort of governance arrangements we might want for outdoors research in the medium term. So people have written that we need to see things like measures to ensure transparency. We'd like to see internationally agreed guidelines for how you choose which research projects you can do, environmental impact assessments, that sort of thing. So there's a certain amount of agreement about medium-term governance arrangements. In the short term, that's much less clear. The things are much more divided. So some people point to the physical risks, some people point to the socio-political risks, and a number of people have said that we shouldn't do any research out of doors until there are specific governance arrangements in order to counter the physical risks and the socio-political risks. The question that we need to answer is, would outdoors research, would a moratorium on outdoors research have necessary effects on the slippery slope, for example, the risks that we move uncritically onto larger research? Would it affect moral hazard, the risk that we start to ignore greenhouse gas emissions? And one thing that I don't think gets as much consideration as it should is, what are the risks of not doing the outdoors research? Some people have suggested that at the moment, when the potential risks of geoengineering haven't been that well characterised. There hasn't been that much research into it. People can really say what they like, so people can paint whatever picture they want to and claim that geoengineering could be the solution to climate problems and so on. Some people feel that if we go ahead and do some outdoors research, we will start to see the full range of side effects of deploying this technology, and that might reduce people's enthusiasm for it. It might prompt a more critical reflection on whether this technology is something we want to take any further and do more risky research on, or whether this is something that perhaps offers more risks than it does benefits. But outdoors research is something that can teach us that.